The drone was already there before anyone admitted it, before the radar alarms spoke up, before a single officer on the bridge of the USS Abraham Lincoln said the word contact out loud, because in modern warfare the most dangerous enemy is the one that watches you first and waits for you to notice too late, and on that night in the dark waters of the Middle East the United States Navy was being watched. At 0217 hours local time, the carrier strike group was cutting through calm seas, black water reflecting nothing but stars and the low glow of operational lights, a floating city of steel moving with quiet purpose, every sailor believing the night would pass like so many others until the air defense console flickered, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to make a junior radar operator lean closer to the screen and squint, because something small, something deliberate, had entered the picture from the east. It wasn't fast, and that was the problem. Fast targets scream their intentions, missiles announce themselves, jets roar, but this contact moved with patience, holding altitude, hugging a profile that suggested intelligence gathering rather than attack, and as the system refined its track the classification algorithm hesitated, which made the human behind the screen hesitate too, because hesitation is what uncertainty feeds on. The operator called it in quietly, almost apologetically, and the Combat Information Center shifted from routine to alert without drama, screens adjusting, voices lowering, the carrier's defensive network waking up layer by layer as officers began asking the same unspoken question in different ways: who sent it and why now? The drone didn't answer, of course. It kept coming. At first the assumption was simple: commercial traffic, a lost surveillance platform, maybe even a friendly asset off its assigned track, but those assumptions fell apart as identification checks came back empty, no transponder, no cooperative signals, no response to standard hails, and suddenly the words unidentified unmanned aerial system carried weight, because in this region nothing flies without a reason and no one makes mistakes that drift this close to a U.S. nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. The USS Abraham Lincoln had been operating in the region for weeks, projecting presence, reminding adversaries that certain lines still existed even in a world where lines were constantly tested, and somewhere beyond the horizon someone had decided to test one, not with a missile, not with a fighter jet, but with a small drone designed to see without being seen, to probe reactions, to collect data, to measure restraint. The drone closed the distance slowly, methodically, flying a profile that suggested confidence, and that confidence was noted, because confidence in contested airspace means backing, and backing means a flag even if it isn't painted on the fuselage. Within minutes the intelligence officers had their suspicions: Iranian design features, flight characteristics consistent with known Revolutionary Guard platforms, a familiar pattern disguised as plausible deniability, and as the track data updated the mood inside the ship hardened, because this was no accident and no coincidence. Rules of engagement were reviewed in real time, not shouted, not dramatized, but weighed carefully, because shooting down a drone is easy, but living with the consequences is not, and every action at sea echoes far beyond the waterline, into headlines, diplomatic cables, and retaliatory planning rooms on the other side of the world. The captain was informed, then the strike group commander, and the decision chain tightened as the drone crossed an invisible threshold that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with intent. Because intent isn't measured in miles, it's measured in persistence. The drone didn't turn away. It didn't climb. It didn't signal. It just watched. And that was enough. Defensive assets were brought to readiness, electronic warfare systems standing by, surface combatants adjusting formation subtly, not enough for an observer to notice unless they knew exactly what to look for, and somewhere inside the carrier a young sailor who had joined the Navy thinking about travel and stability realized they were now part of a moment that would be replayed and argued over by people who had never smelled jet fuel at night or felt a ship hum under their feet. The first option was jamming, because jamming leaves fewer fingerprints, but the drone adapted, shifting frequencies in a way that confirmed what intelligence already suspected: this was not a hobbyist's toy and not a rogue civilian craft, this was state-sponsored, programmed, deliberate, and now openly defiant. As the drone continued its approach, the question stopped being what is it and became what message does it carry, and more importantly, what message will the response send back? The United States Navy had been here before, watched before, tested before, and every time the calculation was the same: allow too much and weakness is assumed, respond too hard and escalation becomes inevitable, and in that narrow space between restraint and resolve decisions are made in seconds that shape weeks, months, sometimes years. The drone crossed the final engagement line. No warning shots were fired. No dramatic countdown echoed through the ship. A single authorization was given, calm and controlled, passed through secure channels, acknowledged without ceremony, because professionalism doesn't raise its voice even when history is listening. On a nearby escort vessel, systems locked on, tracking refined, fire control solutions calculated and rechecked, and in that moment the drone was no longer a mystery but a target, a deliberate intrusion answered by deliberate force. The weapon fired. The night flashed briefly, not enough to light the sky, just enough to end the question. The drone disappeared from radar, then from existence, fragments falling into the sea where evidence sinks quickly and stories begin to float, and across the strike group a collective breath was released, not relief, not celebration, but readiness, because everyone understood this was not the end of something but the beginning of a narrative that would unfold far beyond the water. Within minutes, reports were moving up the chain, initial assessments transmitted, video archived, timelines locked, and somewhere on the other side of the region someone was already drafting a statement, already deciding how to describe what had just happened without admitting why it had happened at all. On the Abraham Lincoln, operations resumed with precision, but the atmosphere had changed, because when a drone is shot down near a carrier it is never just about the drone, it is about deterrence, about lines drawn and erased and redrawn again, about how close is too close and how far is far enough. And as the carrier continued its course through the dark water, one truth settled in quietly among the crew: the encounter was over, but the message had been sent in both directions, and the response to that message had not yet arrived. The response did arrive, just not as a missile or a broadcast announcement, but as silence thick enough to feel, because silence after an incident like this is never empty, it is deliberate, it is measured, and it is usually temporary. By sunrise, satellite feeds confirmed what the crew already knew: the drone had been Iranian in origin, its flight path reconstructed from fragments of data, its launch point estimated but never publicly confirmed, and within hours unnamed officials were briefing unnamed reporters using very specific language designed to sound calm while saying everything that needed to be heard without actually being said. The phrase defensive action entered the conversation early, followed closely by international waters, routine operations, and threat mitigation, and every one of those phrases was chosen carefully, because words are weapons long before steel ever moves. Inside the USS Abraham Lincoln, the mood had settled into a focused tension, the kind that doesn't disrupt operations but sharpens them, because every sailor understood that the shootdown had reset the board, and resets invite responses, not always immediately, not always directly, but always deliberately. Intelligence updates began arriving in layers, signals activity increased along known Iranian command networks, regional proxy chatter spiked, maritime patrol aircraft adjusted their patterns, and the carrier strike group subtly shifted posture, not changing course dramatically but preparing for contingencies that don't show up on public maps. The drone incident was already being framed differently depending on which capital you listen to. In Washington, it was a clear act of self-defense. In Tehran, it was an aggressive provocation. In Allied briefings, it was an expected outcome of increasing pressure. And in the spaces between those narratives, analysts watched for what would come next, because Iran rarely responds symmetrically, and patience has always been one of its most effective tools. 48 hours later, the first sign appeared, not near the carrier, not even at sea, but as a cyber intrusion attempt against logistics networks tied indirectly to naval operations, probing rather than destructive, testing response times, mapping defenses, sending a quiet signal that the incident had been noted and filed. The attempt was blocked, logged, and escalated, but it confirmed what commanders already suspected: the engagement had moved beyond a single drone and into a broader contest of pressure. Meanwhile, additional unmanned systems were detected in the region, not approaching the carrier directly, but flying parallel tracks farther out, just close enough to be noticed, just far enough to avoid immediate engagement, creating a pattern that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. This was the long game. On the Abraham Lincoln, flight operations continued, jets launching and recovering with mechanical precision, pilots briefed not just on weather and targets but on posture and perception, because every takeoff was now part of a larger message, one meant to be seen from orbit and interpreted correctly. The captain addressed senior officers privately, emphasizing restraint paired with readiness, reminding them that escalation doesn't always announce itself loudly, sometimes it whispers and waits for someone else to lose discipline first. Then came the statement. Iranian state media released footage of its own, grainy drone videos of U.S. naval vessels taken days earlier, presented as evidence of American vulnerability, accompanied by commentary framing the shootdown as reckless and illegal, carefully avoiding mention of proximity or warnings, because omission can be more powerful than lies. The footage spread quickly, amplified by sympathetic outlets, shared with captions designed to inflame rather than inform, and suddenly the incident wasn't just a military exchange but a narrative battle playing out across screens worldwide. The United States responded predictably: calm statements, reaffirmations of freedom of navigation, reiteration of rules of engagement, and quiet reassurances to allies that posture would remain defensive, even as additional assets quietly moved into theater. What the public didn't see was the internal recalculation. Threat matrices were updated, engagement thresholds reviewed, electronic warfare rules refined, because the next drone might not just watch. It might carry something, or it might be bait. On the fifth night after the shootdown, another contact appeared, this one faster, flying lower, approaching from a different vector, and immediately the ship snapped back into the heightened awareness that had become familiar too quickly. This drone behaved differently. It darted, changed altitude abruptly, tested radar coverage deliberately, almost playfully, like a fencer tapping defenses to find weakness, and for several tense minutes it seemed as though history might repeat itself, authorization hovering in that narrow space between monitoring and engagement. But then it turned away. No shots fired, no escalation, just a message delivered and received. That moment mattered more than the shootdown itself, because it showed control on both sides, a mutual recognition that while lines had been tested, neither side was ready to cross the ones that couldn't be uncrossed. Still, restraint doesn't mean resolution. Behind closed doors, planners were already asking harder questions: how many drones would be tolerated, what payloads would change the calculus, how to respond if surveillance turned into swarm tactics, and whether the next move would come from the air, the sea, or somewhere less visible. The Abraham Lincoln remained on station, its presence both stabilizing and provocative depending on perspective, a paradox of power that defines modern deterrence. And as the region watched and waited, one thing became clear to everyone involved: the drone that had been destroyed was only the opening move, and the real test would not be who fired first, but who controlled the pace of what came next. Control of the pace became the unspoken objective on every channel, because whoever dictated tempo dictated risk, and risk was the currency both sides were trading without admitting it. By the start of the second week after the shootdown, the operational picture had thickened, not with explosions or alarms, but with layers of activity that only made sense when viewed together: Iranian naval patrols increasing their visibility, proxy forces adjusting rhetoric, commercial shipping reporting more aggressive flybys, and intelligence analysts drawing lines between dots that on their own meant nothing. On the Abraham Lincoln, fatigue began to settle in, not physical exhaustion but cognitive strain, the kind that comes from constant readiness without release, where every radar blip could be nothing or everything, and every decision carries consequences beyond the horizon. The strike group's escorts rotated watches with precision, air defense officers living inside their consoles, tracking patterns rather than contacts, because patterns reveal intent faster than any single approach ever could. And then the pattern shifted. Multiple small unmanned aerial contacts appeared nearly simultaneously across a wide arc, not converging, not approaching aggressively, but present in numbers large enough to force attention, each one flying just differently enough to complicate classification: altitude, speed, radar cross-section, electronic signature, all slightly varied, like a test designed by someone who had studied American systems very closely. This wasn't surveillance. This was calibration. The drones stayed outside engagement envelopes, never triggering automatic responses, forcing commanders to choose between restraint and action repeatedly, because shooting down one is a statement, shooting down many is a message that cannot be walked back. Electronic warfare systems reached out, touching signals, pushing interference, mapping responses, and the drones responded in kind, some degrading, some compensating, some disappearing entirely, leaving behind questions instead of wreckage. Every interaction was logged, every second recorded, because somewhere else, someone was building a playbook. The tension wasn't lost on regional partners, and allied vessels adjusted their own posture, communications traffic increasing quietly as coordination deepened, ensuring no single action would be misread as unilateral escalation. But the most concerning development didn't come from the air. It came from the water. Reports surfaced of small fast attack craft operating more aggressively in nearby lanes, not engaging, not harassing, but positioning themselves in ways that forced course corrections, testing response times, crowding spaces, and creating the kind of friction where accidents become excuses. The Abraham Lincoln's escorts moved subtly closer, not to threaten but to control space, because control of space prevents chaos, and chaos is where miscalculation thrives. Then, late one night, something unexpected happened. One of the drones broke pattern. Instead of maintaining distance, it descended rapidly, closing the gap far faster than previous contacts, not directly toward the carrier, but toward one of the outer escorts, a calculated move designed to fragment attention and force simultaneous decision-making. Alarms rose, voices sharpened, tracking data stabilized, and within seconds the engagement logic shifted, because this approach crossed from ambiguous to unacceptable. Authorization was requested and granted quickly this time, lessons from the first shootdown already internalized. But before the weapon could fire, the drone abruptly lost altitude and splashed into the sea, self-destructing or malfunctioning depending on who would later tell the story, leaving behind a rapidly dispersing debris field and no clear explanation. No one cheered. Because intentional or not, the message was clear, capability existed, intent could change instantly, and control was becoming harder to maintain. That incident triggered a higher-level response. Diplomatic channels that had been quiet suddenly activated, indirect messages passed through intermediaries, warnings framed as reassurances, reassurances framed as warnings, both sides insisting they did not seek escalation while preparing meticulously for it. Publicly, statements remained measured. Privately, contingency plans expanded. The Abraham Lincoln received updated tasking, extended time on station, additional intelligence assets assigned, and with that came the understanding that the carrier was no longer just present, it was central. Every move it made would now be interpreted. Every restraint analyzed. Every response magnified. For the crew, the abstract nature of geopolitics narrowed into very concrete routines, longer watches, tighter rules, sharper focus, because they weren't just defending a ship, they were holding a line whose exact location no one could clearly define. Then came the breach. Not a physical one, not a missile or a drone crossing a red line, but a leak. Footage surfaced online showing what appeared to be close-up imagery of the carrier's deck operations, angles too precise, too recent, and too detailed to be coincidence, released through unofficial channels with captions hinting at vulnerability and reach. The implication was unmistakable. Someone had seen more than they should have. The Navy moved quickly to assess, investigating whether the imagery came from drones, satellites, compromised systems, or a combination of all three, because the method mattered less than the signal. Surveillance was deeper and more persistent than publicly acknowledged. And that realization shifted the calculus again. Because deterrence depends not just on power, but on uncertainty, and uncertainty was being eroded deliberately, one data point at a time. As the Abraham Lincoln continued its patrol, engines steady, course unchanged, the question facing commanders was no longer whether Iran would respond again, but how far it would go before forcing a decisive choice, and whether that choice would still be theirs to make. By the time the third week began, the environment around the Abraham Lincoln no longer felt reactive, it felt engineered, as if every movement, every signal, every silence had been placed intentionally to shape behavior rather than provoke headlines. The leak changed everything. Internal assessments concluded that the imagery had likely been captured through a layered approach, high-altitude satellites synchronized with low observable drones and augmented by cyber reconnaissance, a level of coordination that removed any remaining doubt about state-level orchestration. That meant the contest had matured. This was no longer about probing defenses. It was about demonstrating reach. In response, operational security tightened further, deck procedures adjusted, communication windows shortened, and even routine patterns were altered, because predictability is a vulnerability and vulnerability invites exploitation. At the same time, the United States made a deliberate choice not to withdraw or escalate visibly, a signal in itself, because leaving would suggest pressure had worked, and striking harder would validate the narrative of aggression others were eager to sell. So the carrier stayed. And because it stayed, the next move shifted again. Signals intelligence detected increased coordination among Iranian naval units farther north, not approaching directly, but aligning in ways that suggested a contingency rather than a demonstration, command nodes lighting up briefly before going dark again, a rhythm that spoke of rehearsals. Then came the night that forced clarity. Shortly after midnight, multiple aerial contacts appeared simultaneously at different altitudes, different speeds, approaching from different vectors, far more than before, not a swarm yet, but enough to saturate attention and compress decision time. This was escalation, not in violence, but in complexity. The Combat Information Center became a controlled storm of data, officers calling out tracks, systems prioritizing threats, electronic warfare reaching outward aggressively, and through it all, the carrier's posture remained steady, because panic is more dangerous than any drone. Some contacts turned away. Others pressed closer. Two descended sharply. One went dark entirely. The uncertainty was deliberate. Weapons were armed but not fired, commanders waiting for that final indicator that would justify irreversible action, knowing that the wrong call in either direction could cascade into something far larger than any single ship or region. Then, in a move that surprised even seasoned planners, one drone transmitted. Not a voice. Not coordinates. A burst of encrypted telemetry designed to be detected but not decoded, a digital knock on the door that said we are here and we want you to know it. The message wasn't for the crew. It was for the policymakers. Within minutes, secure channels lit up, Washington pulled into the loop in real time, briefings accelerating from operational to strategic, because this wasn't just a local commander's decision anymore. This was a crossroads. The drone formation held position briefly, then peeled away in perfect coordination, disappearing as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind an uncomfortable realization: escalation had been demonstrated without crossing the line that would allow an easy response. And that was the point. Hours later, back-channel communication finally came through intermediaries, carefully worded and intentionally vague, asserting sovereignty, warning against miscalculation, and implying consequences without specifying them, the diplomatic equivalent of flying just outside engagement range. The United States responded just as carefully, reaffirming defensive intent, reiterating freedom of navigation, and making it clear that any direct threat would be met decisively, language designed to stabilize without conceding ground. For the crew of the Abraham Lincoln, the abstract chess match translated into one simple reality: the margin for error was shrinking. Fatigue deepened. Focus sharpened. Every watch felt heavier than the last. Then came the incident that tipped the balance. During a routine night recovery, as aircraft cycled back onto the deck, a fast-moving unmanned surface vessel was detected inside the outer security ring, low profile, minimal signature, approaching at an angle that suggested interception rather than surveillance. This was new. Surface threats carried different implications. Warnings were issued. Electronic interference attempted. The vessel did not respond. It continued inbound. Rules of engagement tightened instantly, because an unmanned surface craft that ignores warnings is not ambiguous, it is hostile by definition, and unlike a drone, it can carry enough explosives to change the shape of a ship. Authorization was granted without delay. The escort engaged. The vessel was destroyed well outside critical range, debris scattering harmlessly across the water, the explosion brief and contained, but the significance immense. This was no longer deniable. Within hours, Iranian outlets accused the United States of attacking defensive patrol assets, while U.S. officials described a clear, imminent threat neutralized professionally, and the narrative lines hardened overnight. The Abraham Lincoln did not move. It stayed exactly where it was. Because leaving now would mean something very different than leaving before. And as the region absorbed the news, one conclusion settled uncomfortably across every briefing room involved: the cycle of testing had reached its limit, and the next step would either formalize restraint or force confrontation, with very little room left in between. The destruction of the unmanned surface vessel closed the door on ambiguity, and once ambiguity is gone, every actor involved is forced to choose between backing down quietly or stepping forward deliberately. Neither side moved publicly. That was the first sign something had changed. No emergency speeches, no immediate retaliatory strikes, no dramatic military repositioning announced for the cameras, just a measured stillness that analysts recognized as preparation rather than restraint. Behind that stillness, the pace accelerated. Regional command centers shifted to extended operations, intelligence fusion cells ran continuously, and allied coordination reached a level usually reserved for open crises, because while no one had declared escalation, everyone was now planning for it. On the Abraham Lincoln, the crew felt the shift immediately, not in orders shouted or alarms blaring, but in the way every evolution was double-checked, every movement cross-referenced, every decision reviewed one level higher than before. The ship had become the center of gravity. Iran's next move did not come from the air or the sea. It came through economics. Within days, commercial shipping insurers raised premiums for vessels transiting nearby routes, citing increased risk, a quiet pressure point that didn't require missiles to disrupt trade, and suddenly shipping companies began rerouting voluntarily, thinning traffic in ways that made the region feel emptier and more fragile. That vacuum mattered, because empty seas amplify every presence. Every warship becomes more visible. Every maneuver more symbolic. The Abraham Lincoln's escorts adjusted again, spacing widened, coverage expanded, not because of an immediate threat, but because control of perception now mattered as much as control of weapons. Then intelligence confirmed what many had feared. Iranian planners were experimenting with coordinated domain pressure, drones to distract, surface craft to probe, cyber operations to blind, economic levers to strain, and information campaigns to shape narrative, all designed to force a response without providing a clean target. This was escalation by accumulation. And it was working. Decision makers in Washington faced narrowing options: tolerate continued pressure and risk normalizing it, or respond decisively and risk igniting a wider conflict, and neither path offered clean outcomes. The Abraham Lincoln remained the focal point because it embodied both presence and restraint, power that could strike but chose not to, a posture that only works if the other side believes the restraint is voluntary, not imposed. That belief was now being tested. Late one evening, a new intelligence report arrived, credible and specific, indicating a coordinated drone operation planned within the next 72 hours, not aimed directly at the carrier, but designed to overwhelm regional sensors and force automated responses, a scenario where machines might act faster than humans could stop them. This crossed a different kind of line. Automation removes diplomacy from the equation. Commanders met in secure spaces, timelines compressed, red lines clarified explicitly rather than implied, and for the first time since the initial shootdown, preemptive options were seriously discussed. Not strikes, disruption, electronic measures, cyber actions, moves that could degrade capability without producing wreckage or martyrs. Authorization was sought. Authorization was granted. And quietly, without public acknowledgement, systems reached outward into networks that were never meant to be touched, injecting doubt, delay, and confusion into planning processes that had relied on precision. The effect was subtle but immediate. Signals went dark unexpectedly. Command nodes reset. Coordination faltered. The planned drone operation did not materialize on schedule. That absence spoke volumes. Iranian messaging shifted again, tone softening slightly, emphasis returning to sovereignty rather than retaliation, a recalibration that suggested the pressure campaign had met resistance where it hadn't anticipated it. But restraint cuts both ways. With pressure relieved, the risk of miscalculation dropped, but the opportunity for resolution opened, and that window is always narrow. Back-channel communications intensified, intermediaries shuttling language that grew less abstract and more practical, deconfliction proposals, notification mechanisms, implicit acknowledgments of boundaries without formal agreements. The Abraham Lincoln continued to hold station through it all, a constant reference point in every conversation, because its presence had become the leverage. Then, almost anticlimactically, the airspace quieted. Drone activity dropped sharply. Surface traffic normalized gradually. Cyber probes diminished. Insurance rates stabilized. No treaty was signed. No victory declared. But the pressure eased. For the crew, the change was noticeable but fragile, a sense that the worst had passed without anyone being able to say why. Yet commanders remained cautious. Because endings that arrive quietly often mask unresolved tensions, and the question now wasn't whether escalation had been avoided, but whether deterrence had been re-established strongly enough to hold. And that answer would depend on what happened next, not in hours or days, but in the final test that would determine whether this confrontation faded into precedent or reignited into something far harder to contain. The quiet that followed did not feel like relief, it felt like suspension, the kind that exists when both sides are waiting to see who blinks first, because true resolution is never declared, it is recognized only after nothing happens for long enough. For nearly a week, the region remained unusually calm. No drones tested boundaries. No fast craft loitered near lanes. No cyber activity rose above background noise. The Abraham Lincoln continued its operations as if nothing had happened, but every watchstander knew better, because calm after pressure is often when the most dangerous assumptions take root. Commanders used the lull carefully. Exercises were conducted under the cover of routine, response times measured, redundancies tested, not to provoke, but to ensure that if calm failed, it would fail on American terms. Intelligence assessments began to converge on a shared conclusion: Iran had achieved what it needed from the confrontation, demonstrating reach, gathering data, signaling resolve, and avoiding a kinetic response that would have justified retaliation. The United States, in turn, had demonstrated discipline, adaptability, and dominance across domains without triggering open conflict. It was a draw, and in strategic terms, draws are sometimes victories. Then came the final test. A single aerial contact appeared at long range, high altitude, steady course, broadcasting a civilian transponder code, but flying a profile inconsistent with commercial traffic, an anomaly subtle enough to be ignored if attention had drifted. It had not. The contact was tracked quietly, cross-checked against flight plans, interrogated electronically, and watched as it approached a boundary that had never been formalized but was now universally understood. Unlike before, no additional contacts accompanied it. No cyber noise spiked. No surface movement aligned. This was deliberate minimalism. A probe reduced to its essence. The aircraft maintained course until the final threshold, then altered heading slightly, a gesture so small it would never appear in a headline, but so precise it carried unmistakable meaning. It turned away. No challenge required. No warning issued. No response triggered. The line held. Within hours, confirmation arrived through intermediaries that deconfliction mechanisms would be respected going forward, not codified, not celebrated, but observed, the kind of understanding that exists only as long as both sides continue to benefit from it. The Abraham Lincoln received updated orders shortly thereafter, a planned rotation adjusted, presence maintained but with reduced emphasis, signaling normalization without withdrawal. For the crew, the change was gradual, watches shortened, posture relaxed incrementally, the tension draining not all at once but in pieces, like pressure slowly released from a sealed chamber. No ceremony marked the end. No announcement named the outcome. But everyone involved understood what had happened. The confrontation had run its course. It had tested limits without breaking them. It had demonstrated capability without triggering catastrophe. And most importantly, it had clarified boundaries that had been dangerously undefined. As the carrier began preparing for its eventual departure from the region, one final intelligence summary circulated quietly among senior leadership, concluding that deterrence had been reinforced not by destruction, but by restraint paired with unmistakable readiness. That lesson mattered, because the next confrontation, somewhere else, someday, would follow the same logic whether anyone admitted it or not. And as the Abraham Lincoln cut through the water under a clear sky, engine steady, flight deck alive with controlled motion, the ship carried more than aircraft and sailors, it carried the weight of a moment where war had been possible, pressure had been intense, and restraint had prevailed, setting the stage for the final accounting of what this standoff truly meant. History rarely marks the moments when war does not happen, yet those moments shape the world just as surely as the ones written in fire. In the weeks that followed the Abraham Lincoln's quiet repositioning, the region settled into a new equilibrium, one that did not erase tension but redefined it, because tension acknowledged is safer than tension denied. The drone shootdown became a reference point rather than a headline, cited in briefings, studied in war colleges, analyzed not for its explosion but for everything that followed it, the restraint, the calibration, the refusal to be pulled into a cycle designed to spiral. Iran did not claim victory. The United States did not declare success. That mutual silence was the outcome. Behind it, subtle changes took hold. Drone flight profiles shifted farther from carrier groups. Naval patrols adopted wider buffers. Cyber activity dropped into background noise rather than pressure spikes. Insurance markets stabilized. Commercial shipping returned to normal routes. None of it happened because of a treaty or an agreement. It happened because boundaries had been tested hard enough to be understood. For the crew of the Abraham Lincoln, the confrontation became something they would carry quietly, a shared experience that wouldn't translate cleanly to stories back home, because how do you explain nights where nothing happened but everything was at stake? They would remember the tension in the air, the way silence felt heavier than alarms, the discipline it took to wait when every instinct urged action. They would remember that the most powerful weapon on the ship was not a missile or a jet, but judgment. Months later, analysts would conclude that the crisis ended not because one side overwhelmed the other, but because both recognized the cost of continuing and the benefit of stopping at the edge. That recognition reshaped future encounters. When new drones appeared in later years, they were met with clearer expectations. When lines were approached, they were approached carefully. The Abraham Lincoln incident became an unspoken lesson that dominance does not require constant demonstration, and deterrence does not always roar. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes, when tested, it responds once and lets the echo do the rest. The drone that fell into the sea that night vanished without wreckage or ceremony, but the signal it sent traveled far beyond the water, into planning rooms, command centers, and quiet calculations on both sides of the world. It said this far, no further. And it was heard. As the carrier continued its journey, indistinguishable from any other deployment in the public record, it carried with it the proof that in a world crowded with surveillance, speed, and automation, restraint remains a choice, and that choice can still shape outcomes. The standoff did not end in victory or defeat. It ended in understanding. And in that understanding, war remained only a possibility, not a reality, which was, in the end, the most decisive outcome of all.